for John to be able. We're waiting for Johnpaul to join us, but we can just start rolling and see what happens. But thank you so much, everyone, for your patience and for joining us today. I hope you were able to catch the first session of this roundtable on housing in Indigenous communities. If not, both panels will be posted to our YouTube channel fairly soon. So check out the social media channels for Harvard Indigenous Design Collective overall. And we'll have some recordings there for you if you're not able to make all of the event or just part of it. So ani bojo ga kinaoya na wakama go kwe indigenous cause cuando dem akabekon don jaba. Welcome and thank you so much for your curiosity in this event and your participation. My name is Elsa. I'm a second-year Master of Design or Master of Architecture student here at the Graduate School of Design. I'm also one of 4 co-founders of the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective, and I'm joined by Heidi and Rogelio, who can introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rogelio. I'm a first-year Master's of Architecture and Urban Design student at the GSD. I'm of Mexican Mestizo descent, and I'm honored to be here with HIDC and all of you.
Heidi Brando Unicia, Hawaiian Nishido, Toriki Nibashichin, Hawaiian A Dashiche do Nashkali Dashinalu. My name is Heidi Brandau, and I'm a second-year Master of Design student, also of Kanaka Maoli and Diné ancestry. And before we begin, we want to thank the Harvard University Native American Program for their support in organizing this event. And we are so grateful to welcome you to a conversation with 3 designers and thinkers whose work has inspired us. We invited you all to this conversation focused on housing as one of many possible ways to consider the intersection of design policy, history, and responsibility to building and living on Indigenous homelands. We are joined this afternoon by Chris Cornelius. Chris Cornelius is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. He is currently a Louis Kahn visiting professor at Yale School of Architecture and focuses his research and practice on the architectural translation of culture, in particular, American Indian culture. He is the founding principal of Studio Indigenous, a design and consulting practice serving American Indian clients. Our second panelist today is Selina Martinez. Selina is a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe and is Xicana born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. She recently completed her Master of Architecture degree at Arizona State University in 2020 and is currently pursuing her architectural license. She has been involved in projects with local tribal nations through the ASU Indigenous Design Collaborative. Selina is the co-founder and lead instructor for Design Empowerment Phoenix. And our third panelist today is Johnpaul Jones. Johnpaul Jones is a partner of the Seattle-based architecture firm Jones & Jones. He is one of the first architects to earn a National Humanities, or is the first architect to earn a National Humanities Medal, and was the lead design consultant for the National Museum of the American Indian. In his work, Jones seeks to pay deep respect to regional architectural traditions that lead to the understanding of Indigenous people and their rich cultural heritage in America.
Thank you, Heidi, for those introductions. And we will also hand it to each of our speakers to introduce themselves further. Briefly, so we'll talk for about an hour with these 3 speakers, and after that we'll take a short break, get some water, and then we will have a question and answer session with the audience. So you'll see a Q&A box in the Zoom webinar, so please feel free to add questions as they come to mind to that box, and we will answer them towards the end. We'll select a few of those questions to respond to directly with our panel, and we'll also try to answer as many as we can in text form at the end there too. So with that, thank you so much, speakers. I will sort of ask you an introductory question one by one and invite you to share some of your own work or how you think about today's topic and housing. So essentially, we're curious, could you tell us about how you envision the role for housing in Indigenous communities, and how does your work connect you with this question? Could I hand it to Chris first?
Sure. Well, let me first introduce myself in my language. Wat kuf no weda du Chris Nyunget Sakwahoni Wagita Loda Okele Oniata Aga the Bagaton Choda. So I said, I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I'm Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. I believe that housing is a human right. And I think that housing for Indigenous people has been a problem for a long time. I feel like it's been one of the sort of primary tools of colonization. And I think that Indigenous people have been underserved by housing. And it's not always about funding, because there are federal programs for funding while they're not completely adequate. But I do think that it's in the mechanisms, policies, and ways that we think about housing for Indigenous people, that's the problem. So as a designer, I'm trying to figure out how should we be looking at housing in particular, and how can we get around some of these issues. And some of the ways of looking at it is to figure out which parts of it are part of the colonization apparatus. Is it in policies? Is it in zoning codes? Is it in building codes? Is it in other sorts of things? And then how do we dismantle those? How do we sort of examine those through Indigenous lenses that are culturally appropriate? Because I believe that, for instance, building codes are one of those forms of colonization. And it's not to say that we would make things unsafe or make things that didn't have lifelong integrity. But how can we rewrite them in ways that are appropriate for cultures that are appropriate for Indigenous people? Can we make building codes as stories? Because those lessons are there for you to use, to take your life lessons from those stories in the oral tradition and use them or not. I believe that that's particularly in it. So I also think that we need to relook at housing itself and the design of it. I think there are plenty of people that are looking at policy and other sorts of things, but for me, it's really about design. How can we think about the design of housing for Indigenous people differently?
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think this connects really well with some comments from our morning session as well, and conversations that the HIDC here at Harvard is very curious about having across the different kinds of disciplinary education that we're receiving, and particularly for those of us who are completing Master of Architecture degrees, the question of what design is efficacious for, what it's good at doing, and what are the right questions to ask in this space are really important for us. So thank you.
So I'm sorry, is this my time to share my slides or not?
Go for it.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to share what we've been working on at Yale. So I have 10 graduate students in my studio. None of them are Indigenous, but we're particularly looking at the Opaskwayak Cree Nation in Manitoba. This is a community that I've been working with for about 3 years now. They're about 6.5 hour drive northwest of Winnipeg, so relatively isolated, but we're looking at housing in this particular place. And so the place that I had the students start is in this sort of mapping exercise. How can they pull in different sort of cultural elements, physical elements, geological things, examining the forestry, the trees, the land base, ignoring scale, and other sorts of devices that I think can be tools, again, of colonization and mapping, but to begin to look at other sort of cultural elements and the ways that stories are told, the regalia that's part of the community. And so unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we couldn't go there, but I have other people that are from that community, have had virtual visits with the students. And so they begin to think about that. And all of this kind of stemmed from an observation that I had when I went there, that all of this housing is exactly the same. And this is one of the students' sort of examinations of that. When you look at just 3 different places, you'll notice that the houses are exactly the same. And the thing that was really particularly poignant for me was that it's the same as the HUD house that I grew up in. on the Oneida Reservation, just west of Green Bay. It's exactly the same house. It just is placed in the landscape in a different way. And one of the things that one of the students noticed is how disconnected from the land these things actually are. And then when you start to examine how these houses are laid out, they're laid out with a complete, I think, lack of care. They're not even lined up. They don't have driveways or like gravel. They don't have sidewalks. The spacing is sort of really far apart. They really don't have much of lawns and things like that. And so when you compare it to the typical block of this community, the PA, the ones that are non-Indigenous, those blocks are very trimmed and neat and have lawns, you have sidewalks, have trees. Like none of that is part of this native housing. So we were looking at how can you pull cultural elements into this way of thinking about housing. And so we've talked a lot about this semester. We've talked a lot about Indigenous ontology, Indigenous epistemology, and Indigenous axiology. So borrowing terms from Western education to apply them to the ways that we think about indigeneity. And this student was thinking about how do you decolonize the line, the boundary at which the reservation happens. How can we begin to decolonize that in the way that we would make the line inclusive instead of exclusive? That's one way of doing it. This particular student was using a gaming engine to begin to look at the different ways of understanding the non-human perspective. Can we begin to think about this relationality where we think of all of all living things as our relations, and how can we begin to represent those? So the first one was a wolf. This one is a muskrat. How do you begin to look at these? How do you see the world through these particular lenses? How can we begin to reify data? Could we begin to think about data in a sort of spiritual way? Could we begin to use it as a way of understanding the world through this sort of ontology and thinking about Indigenous knowledge as epistemological, that it is a kind of knowledge? And how do we begin to pull those things into housing and how it's represented? How do we begin to think about the relationality, all of these other sort of cultural things that lend themselves to the housing, that the people that live in these homes, they don't live in the same ways that they're designed, right? They're not the nuclear family, 2 parents, 2 kids in a 3-bedroom home. Oftentimes there's 8, 9 people in the home. In this particular community, there's a shortage of homes by 880 units. We're not going to be able to solve that problem, but what we want to do is to offer a series of solutions that begin aspects of the culture. Then how do we integrate those into the design problem, and how do we integrate those into the design conversations? Yeah, Wako, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We were really excited to see kind of what's going on next door at Yale this semester. So thanks so much for bringing these examples of the work that's ongoing there with graduate students. It's really helpful. Maybe we can hand it next to Selina Martinez to similarly kind of give us a sense of your perspective on housing, how you're working with this kind of role in your own work, and how else would you introduce yourself for this panel?
Let me share. Oh, I cannot share screen at the moment.
Is my screen still up?
Yeah, Chris, if you could stop sharing, that would be great. But
You know
I
what?
think
I cannot. I've completely. Oh, there it is. I lost Zoom.
I think it's good now.
This is great. Thank you.
Okay. So sorry.
Okay.
Trickster working on my technology today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Selina Martinez. And, you know, architecture has been a lens to explore my own identity in relation to housing and in a kind of indirect way, I suppose. But, you know, looking at the ancestrality of where my tribe originally comes from within Sonora, Mexico, and the environment in which, in which these species that are embedded in our environment and connected to our emergent stories and to the river in which we come from has kind of been the way that I've been looking at and exploring this idea of cultural keystone species and the variety of species that are connected to a specific people, whether that's within their diets, the materials used within the architecture, medicines, languages, traditions, histories, and spiritual practices, storytelling, and seeing that correlation between the different species, whether that's in ceremony or in architecture, and the use of that within our homeland and within our contemporary settings within the United States as well, due to our migration and our variety of communities that we live in. And looking at, that vernacular intelligence and the spatial behaviors of how we kind of originally were living within more of a compound setting or in a variety of different types of building within these diverse desert climates. And this influence, what I was really inspired by was Brianne Leban. She's actually a Hopi architecture student who graduated a while ago under Wanda Della Costa as well. And she said this thing about how can our housing or how can our dwellings help us practice our culture? And that really has always stuck with me. And I think looking at it from that lens for me moving forward into the project here has been something that really opens up the idea as using architecture as a tool. And what you see here on screen is a definition of what is Indigenous architecture according to Matunga from the Handbook of Contemporary Indigenous Architecture. And he outlines all of these different layers that could potentially be embedded into Indigenous architecture, whether that's ancestrality, Indigenous knowledge, land in place, spatial behavior, that vernacular design intelligence, and even celestial connections to evolve and continue tradition, but also reinterpret. This is a project that I worked on through the IDC at ASU with the Gila River community. So using that definition to outline the way that we begin to measure or quantify or even use as parameters or a framework for how we begin to understand working with different communities. So looking at the farming in the desert and the Hugam lifeways, looking at the cultural keystone species in relation to O'odham culture. Once again, looking at those traditional structures built from the local resources and from that environment. Also looking at those resultant architectures, the celestial learning lessons from Casa Grande, and then using other frameworks to hybridize and begin to build a measurable outcome for the community. On the left, we see the aims from the Gila River community given to us by the governor, and then we're trying to align those with the Living Building Challenge, which is similar to LEED, but I think it's a little bit stronger because it incorporates beauty and other aspects that can be considered and measurable within projects. And this project has been an ongoing project for like 4 years, with several engagement sessions starting with Adobe block making at their fairgrounds, at the Mochita Fairgrounds, even building prototype shade structures to reconnect to those original ways of building, along with having engagement sessions with community to talk about what they want to see in housing, and also begin to map out a variety of different ways that they use space, and then using those actually in, we held a live 3D modeling engagement where we were literally, trying to build 3D models alongside community with direct input to influence a variety of prototypes. And then using, the words that those community members were saying, the issues they were identifying, aligning those to the Living Building Challenge, and finding a variety of solutions that they already were hoping to see in their housing. so many amazing insights to that. They already have that understanding, and it's just about drawing that type of information out of them and putting that back into the design to create, an architecture that is informed by the way that they hope to celebrate their lifeways as a community and promote those cultural practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Selina. There's so much richness there, and I really hope that we'll talk more about it, but that maybe that you can also share some links to some of the ongoing work that you're doing directly with the attendees of the events. They can check it out on their own time as well. And then I know we're having some technical issues on multiple fronts, but Johnpaul, if you're here, and if you can hear me, I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to add to your introduction before I play a video.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. No, I just have a couple of things to say. I've avoided native housing for 50 years now because I had a pretty difficult experience when I first came out of college, similar to what Chris pointed out, which it was, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they just did the same house everywhere in the tropics, in the, desert, in the snow. And I just got discouraged and thought, I'm not going to be involved in that. If they just tell us what to do, I don't want to just draw it all up. And so it's nice to see all of these young Native architects really trying to kind of break that mold and add something that's more identifiable and goes along with the identity of the people. So, but what I want to show, and I'm not going to show a lot of things, is that this project that is called the Chief Seattle Club All project, which means home. And here in Seattle, there's a large number of homeless urban Indian people. And there's been a club that was established many years ago when we remodeled an old building down in Pioneer Square for them. And they serve, take care of people, let them take showers, give them counseling, help find them a place to stay, and just on and on like that. And it's been very successful, but the club realized that they needed some urban housing for those Native people that are on their transition out of, being homeless. And the project is just for adults. The families are being handled in another part of the city with family housing and another Native group. But what is inspiring to me about this project, it had to fit into an urban setting that's right in amongst some very tall buildings. And it had to have some identity to kind of appeal to the diversity of their clients. And it had to look like and meet the requirements in the Seattle's Pioneer Square district, which is, basically a brick building and a certain window pattern. And so at first I just thought I'd serve as an advisor. They asked me to serve as an advisor to help the architects that were doing it, to give it more, native feel to it. And eventually they asked me to take it over and finish the design and finish the drawings. And it's under construction. It'll be available for use this coming fall. And out of this program, they've started, since they had to wait about a year for this thing to be built during the pandemic periods, this group, this Chief Seattle Club group, are such enthusiastic, it's run by young Native educated people that are just great energies. I love it. And what they've done, besides get this big housing thing started, they said, well, how do we take care of people right now? So they set up some somebody has manufactured taking shipping containers and turn them into 2 units with a bathroom and a kitchen and all that. So on their own, they got this set up, got a piece of land, they call it a native village. And within about 2 months, they had housing immediately to take care of some of the homeless Native people that they can. And then on top of that, they realized that they need to raise food and help in the education of the sovereignty of food for Native people. So they started an indigenous farm nearby, and that's helping to be run. So they're doing all kinds of things, but doing this major multi-story, 8-story, 80-unit homeless housing thing. And within that are a number of stuff. But I thought what would really be helpful for all of you to see is their video about this. And if you could play that, I think I'd say a little bit more about it.
Yes, so I will play this video. It's just a few minutes long, and then we will kind of go over to conversation with all of our panelists. And ideally, videos will be working, but if we have to do this as kind of a voice conversation, we'll do that as well. So let me cue up this video here.
I think you'll see the enthusiasm here that really is inspiring.
Okay, and because I am sharing the video, I would need someone to audibly, so Jason, maybe audibly tell me if the video quality is not good.
Yeah.
The mission of Chief Seattle Club is to create sacred space to nurture, affirm, and renew the spirit of urban Native people. And we believe that it is our sacred responsibility to find ways to support our Native community who are experiencing homelessness. We know that if you're a Native American and you live in the city of Seattle, you are 7 times more likely to be homeless. So we, as a Native community, Native-led organization, said we will respond. We can provide a culturally appropriate housing that will serve our relatives in a way that no one else can. All is a Lashutsi word for home. So there'll be 80 units of housing. We'll have a clinic that people can go and get to take care of their medical needs. We'll have an art gallery. We'll have workforce development. And this project is going to look and feel like a Native project from the inside out. And I think it's going to be a project that we can all be really proud of right here in the heart of Pioneer Square.
In doing an architectural design, Chief Seattle Club made it pretty clear to us that they want to honor Indigenous people. They want to honor the cultural heritage of the Coast Salish people, this was Central Coast Salish people in this area, and then also the diversity of their Native clients, and bring that into the project.
And another thing that was intriguing was, one is it's in Pioneer Square, which is the oldest settled neighborhood in Seattle, but there's also a longer history there that has not been talked about as much. And this was a great opportunity for the Chief Seattle Club to tell that story in the architecture.
Chief Seattle Club was very vital to me in my early days. I was homeless on the streets for about a month or so at that time. And when I came into Chief Seattle Club, the very first thing I remember coming into, hearing the big drum going on in the gathering circle. I mean, I really felt like I wasn't alone for the first time in a very long time. And I think that's what the members get today. There's a sense of loss of culture, loss of identity. And when they come to the Chief Seattle Club, they get that. They can reconnect in a place that they can feel safe and revitalize that Native spirit.
If it weren't for Chief Seattle Club, I wouldn't be able to survive out here. You just feel at home here because there's an understanding within the tribes when you meet people here that we're all in this together. You know, people understand each other, where they came from or where they're coming from.
This project, this expansion, this optimistic, forward-looking campaign to grow the facility right at the core of this remarkable city, to not just solve the problem of Native homelessness, but to celebrate Native life that we all spring from. We all need to get on board with that.
It's just one of the most exciting campaigns and initiatives that's happening, I think, for Native people anywhere in the country right now, and we're lucky that it's happening here in Seattle. So it's a great organization and everyone should support it.
We want want to invite you to join us. This is about a movement. This isn't just about one campaign or one building. This is about Native people saying, we know how to take care of our people. We believe that our relatives deserve to come inside into secure housing. Join us in this movement that is going to change the world, because when we bring Native people inside into secure housing, we're going to see their ideas come forward in amazing ways. So this is a compelling opportunity, and we want to invite you to be a part of the work that we're doing here at Chief Seattle Club and for all building. Join us. Let's build all together.
Let's build all together.
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 Let's build all together.
All together.
Okay. I think, how do you, as an architect, how do you help design something that will turn it into a home so these homeless Native people will have a chance to get healthy? And again, and so we got the affordable housing. Each unit's about 300 plus square feet. It goes up to about 500 for two people to live in, but most of it's one person. And there's an overall 59,000 square feet in the whole building. And then there's some gathering spaces in the building where I'm not going to show you that, but we built in where you could step outside and have blessings and with smoke. There's a Seattle Indian Health Board, which is another organization here in Seattle, has started doing satellite clinics around the city, and this will be the first one. It'll be in the lower part of the building, and it'll not just serve the homeless here, but it serves the whole Native people that are in the whole area. And then there's some private space, and then there's a cafe, and then an art gallery, and then to help add to the diversity, to make it comfortable for the diversity of Native people that come in, it's been tied to the plants, healthful plants that are well known for helping and healing, and those are being done in artwork, room identification, just everything throughout the whole building. And then there's a big movement of hiring only Native artists to do a number of major pieces and smaller, medium to smaller pieces throughout the whole building, so that we can just really create some Native Indigenous identity, and I do a lot of work for various tribes, and that's a little easier for me because you can really work with that. But when you're dealing with a kind of an urban area like this building, or like what we do at universities where they have a diversity of students, we really try to say, what can we do to kind of make everybody feel like it's their place and their home, and the identity is the right thing. So it's been a big effort. And I'm going to send to the Harvard Coalition Group some plans and other things, about 20 pages of, so you can see the plans and they can be brought up pretty easily. But thank you.
Thank you for that, Johnpaul. Thank you for bringing this project and sharing it with us. Because I think that it brings up really interesting questions that do connect to kind of what Chris and Selina are putting on the table for us, which is that there's incredible specificity to working with different nations, and especially when you're working in the university context. That's of course on Indigenous lands in the US, but you're not working with Native students, of whom there are not very many in the US still. Or when you are working in your homelands, and you're kind of working through the university system to bring this like specificity of these teachings through curriculum that was not designed to include Indigenous worldviews at all, and sort of bringing in that knowledge, and then working on housing in urban contexts where you have a whole variety of nations and their residents with really specific needs in the city, to be able to create that kind of housing. There seems to be like a a really productive complexity to needing to answer all of these questions kind of together, that there isn't one sort of development-driven way of creating housing for these communities, but instead these like many layers of care and expertise that come to bear in each of your work. So with all that, I'm wondering if we could kind of take it speaker to speaker. I'm curious to hear more from these intros and from your own work. Where are some sites of, so say like optimism, or where have you seen things work really well, where you're able to ask some of these really complex questions about creating housing and a specificity piece through design? And what does that look like for you? Maybe Chris or Selina.
Sure. I, with our engagement with the community at OCN and over my time of working with them, one of the things is that they want homes that don't look anything like those homes, because they understand and associate them with all sort of federally funded governmental housing. And so the form of it is to them kind of important in the sense that it's different. And for me as a designer, that's what I want to hear, right? Because I think it's a matter of coming up with a new sort of methodology, because I don't think it's a model, a type, or a style kind of question. It is a sort of methodology of design, and beginning to think about how do we accommodate families that are different, that, are, you might have to bring your adult cousins into your home, or your adult brother, or your grandmother, or your grandfather, or someone. You could have grandparents and grandchildren, babies and elders in the same home. It's just common, for how Indigenous people live. And so how do we begin to accommodate those kinds of things? But for me, that's where the optimism is. In the housing director of OCN too has been sort of receptive to new ways of thinking about the design of these homes. For me, it's in the studio, it's about developing an entire methodology, and then how do I get that methodology to fit into the sort of pragmatic parts of it, of budget and of other sort of things. But I think if we always stayed at that sort of level, we'll always sort of edit out or parse out different things. And so if I can try to get these ideas out and begin to think about how do we expand these notions. We've had a lot of conversations in the studio about this idea, which was brought up this morning's panel, is that housing in America traditionally is seen as a way of creating generational wealth, right? Like you have a home, your parents have a home, they pass away, you inherit it, or you have a home and you sell it and you buy a bigger home. Like that model is not really what happens on reservations, in particular when people hold the land in trust, where the land belongs to the nation, and you lease it, and you really only sort of could own the structure. So those are ways that we're trying to, in the studio, we're having these conversations about like, well, how do we begin to address that? Are there ways to rethink that sort of model? And how do we begin to use the idea of a collective sort of wealth that happens in the nation that you might be working with, as opposed to individual wealth, because it's never been a culture of this sort of individual wealth and pursuit of wealth. It's always been a collective thing. So yeah, I'm optimistic with how engaged my students actually are. My non-Indigenous students are engaged with the ideas.
Yeah, and I would add, just from my involvement in the Gila River project, I think the complexity of mindsets in the stakeholder groups, the community, the people making the decisions within the tribal government, the different consultants that are being brought in as far as like contractors, and getting this prototype funded has gotten really chaotic, especially with the implications of COVID on our communities. And, just in this moment of time, it makes getting this project done really difficult. But I think the strength of this project that I spoke to earlier is the approach from a bioclimatic kind of methodology, and always trying to consider, you know, especially within the context of Arizona, our heat is very extreme, and trying to mitigate that is definitely a #1 priority, especially when it comes to the efficiencies of building, the comfort levels within these buildings. I know Chris showed an example of the same exact building within the context of the desert, and those are degrading over time, and they are not, the AC bills are insane, like for the people living in these houses, and the multi-generational aspect. There are so many layers to trying to alleviate these problems. And I think Gila River, you know, has a different set of, or is in a context where it can tap into a bigger infrastructure within the Phoenix area, which is amazing. But I think there's all those other issues of mass production as well, and all those people on the waiting list to get those houses, and, you know, culture, incorporating culture through the sense of nature has been a strong value for the project that we were able to develop, and dealing with the parameters of the contractors as well is very complicated, but I think it has resulted in an interesting building type that focuses more so on passive design in a sense.
That Johnpaul, if you have anything to add to that in terms of sort of causes for optimism,
well,
locate that up.
Yeah, it's much different than what Chris and Selina are dealing with in the urban area. But no matter what, it's as Native people, we have connections to all the directions. Some people like to be where they wake up in the morning and see the sun come up, and some like to be on where they watch the sun go down, and some like to just be in the sun, you know. And when we first took over this project, the architect was doing something really efficient. You know, he had all the units, the 12 units per floor, all lined up like a dormitory, and then a hallway on the back side. And it was, what I told the client is this is institutional. This is really institutional. And you've got people you're trying to house that are working their way out of homelessness, drugs, and difficulty, and they don't need to be stuck in something institutional. So how do you deal with that? So I had them change the floors around. So four of the units faced, you know, east, 4 of the units face south, 4 of the units could face west, but we couldn't face north because of the taller building next door. But just that little simple thing, when we presented it to their clients, the club's clients, people were saying, "Oh, this will help me a lot." You know, just being able to choose, just to be able to choose a little bit. And so those are the kind of things that are really important throughout as you do these kind of projects, is to provide some opportunities for different kinds of things that all humans like to have. But I have something from my Choctaw heritage that is very important that my grandmother and mother and my aunts all gave me, and it's something I use continually in the design, and it has to do with 4 worlds. You've got to connect with these 4 worlds, the natural world, all kinds of things in a natural world. It's not just plants, it's really dirt, clouds, sky, everything. And then the other one is the animal world. There's a lot that we should do on these projects to bring the animal world down here, because it really does help. It signals seasons. And then the spirit world, I don't call it the spiritual world, but the spirit world, that things are alive all around you. And that part of our heritage is really a strong thing. And then the last one is the human world. And that's the really important one. And that's where you provide places for people to share, not just classrooms, but to share each other, to help them get well, to share, you know, other views of life. So I try to build those 4 worlds into even an urban design or into working for a native community somewhere. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that's really important to help in that diversity and to bring life and realism and healthfulness to our work. So besides trying to do a good design too. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I think that there's, I mean, there's a profoundness, I think, in each of your kind of responses to this, which seems to have a lot to do with providing agency, and that there's agency in doing good design work, and as well as like the kind of agency and choice, and whether that's tribal sovereignty and the self-determination and the ways that people are able to live and accommodate one another and expand for their families, as well as treating the environments around them and asserting that presence in a variety of ways. All of those seem to be sort of the crucial things at stake when we consider design for Indigenous communities. So I'm curious if all of this that's kind of swirling around in the conversation, as well as sort of as we think about the complexities of all the different threads that are brought into a particular project, whether that's that we're talking about the urban constraints or the methods that are taught in school, those kind of other pressures on a project. I'm curious how you in a project that you've worked on have digested a lot of this complexity or located spaces for that agency in conversation with community.
For me, it's because I do a lot of sort of community engagement work, and each time I sort of start that process, I've been trying to think about how can I decolonize that process, meaning like I'm not coming in there as the design professional with the whiteboard and the markers and saying, well, what do you guys want? You know, like start asking a bunch of questions. Sometimes it might mean just like talking with people. I've always found that, you know, I get the best sort of input out of just having conversations with people, maybe giving prompts to respond to, but then I get so much more content out of that particular process. But I think that, so once I get that information, for me, it's really important to give that back graphically. It's a thing that I can do as a designer, and it's visual representation is really kind of my expertise. Is what I teach in. But so I've always wanted to take that information and make it visual, because I find that people respond to it. And I do think that Indigenous people have a sort of visual literacy that is at a particular high level, I would say, right? Like we respond very quickly to visual things, right? We've always been producing art. We've always been producing structures and architecture. I think that that's just who we are. But so for me, it's about like, how do I visually represent that? Even if it's like, if I'm talking about cultural values, am I talking about program of building? Am I talking about data? Am I talking about, you know, flow charts and matrices or whatever it is? How can I visually represent that in a way that it's easier to kind of intellectually metabolize, so that the community knows that myself as a designer, that I've heard what they said and I'm kind of visually giving it back to them to say, this is how I've responded. So for me, the answer to that question is really just like, how can I make it visual? Like, how can I think about those things visually? So just a specific example, and I talk about it in my other sort of longer form lectures. When I was working on the Indian Community School of Milwaukee with Antoine Predock, we really talked about like the fact that this building is going into this particular context affects everything. So it affects every sort of terrestrial animal on the surface and below the surface, all the way up to the moon. And so I made this graphic that shows you that entire thing. It's the entire site all the way up to the moon, and then all the subterranean animals as far down as they sort of burrow. It's in that, like, making that thing and making it visual, that I found that the community responded to the way that we were thinking about the project. It wasn't just enough for us to go and say that we were thinking about that, but to have that visual representation was really important.
And I would also add, similarly, you know, the relationship is the most important part, I think, when working with Indigenous communities, because if there's no trust there, then the project will not be successful. At least from my opinion and my experiences so far. I know I'm still fairly young, but I think for me, that has been the thing that I've noticed the most, and where I put most of my energy is to be authentic and genuine with the people I'm interacting with, and not putting myself as that expert. I am giving them the opportunity and the space for them to speak. Juan and I like to talk about, when we're engaging with people and how we teach people to engage with people is that they are speaking 90% of the time, we're speaking 10% of the time, to let them really self-drive the project and the direction and not have our voice, kind of conquer the room or, fully direct the entire engagement, along with having a variety of different engagement methods for smaller groups, larger groups, one-on-one sessions, a variety of different ways, obviously depending on the capacity of the project and the scale of the project. But I think really just being genuine in the relationships that you're creating with Indigenous people because of the historical past that has occurred through colonization to our people. So I think that is a huge learning lesson for anyone who wants to work with Indigenous peoples or work with Indigenous communities, listen more. And I think that's the most important part.
Okay. In the urban area of Seattle, where do you find homeless Native people? I mean, it's really, there's some places where they congregate, but so what we found is that the club provides breakfast and lunch. That's all they can do right now. They don't really provide any sleeping over or anything. But so what I decided is that, well, okay, I was going to interrupt when everybody was there getting their breakfast or their lunch. And we used, just like what Chris was saying, we used a lot of graphics. We put things up on the wall, talked to them, apologized for interrupting them and doing all that. But since they're there every day, we left it for them to be able to mark, did they like this? Do they want this in there? Before we actually did any design work, we got that's how we got a lot of input on it. And when I'm working oftentimes with one particular Native community, during the process of the very beginning, when we're talking about the vision and the goals, I have to separate the elder women from the elder men. And everybody says, well, why do you do that? Well, it's good that you start together. But a lot of the Native communities up here in the Northwest is that the women are pretty polite and they let the men talk first and then they say very little. So you miss out on a huge amount of information. So I like to separate them out and bring them back together and do that. And I do the same thing with the young adults in the community too. The same thing. It's how do you get them to come? Because the husbands, the wives are working, they're tired, they want to do things in the evening. So what we do is we start with their kids and work with their kids and get a lot of input from them. And then they make models and stuff and we put them up and then we say, okay, tonight we're going to provide food. And so ask your parents to come with you and you can show them what you've done. So we get the young adults to come out. And then at the same time, we can show them what we're doing and they get a chance to input into it. So there's all kinds of ways like this that you can do this to get input. But I've been helping with some big hospital projects for architects that are doing big Native hospitals in Alaska. And in the same way as we go out to isolated villages, I found that separating them a little bit allows the women to be a little more comfortable and they'll tell you a little bit more. The men can, do the same thing. So it varies. You just have to use it as the best way you possibly can. So,
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of strength in the design intuition, especially when Native architects can help to make sure these conversations are happening and make sure they're happening in a way that's accessible to a lot of people and their own sensibilities and the knowledge that can be brought to architecture as opposed to the knowledge that architecture necessarily generates. They're certainly not the same thing. And in some ways, I think we're getting from this conversation that there are certainly things that architects can do and can know and the kinds of knowledge that can be built there. And coming from both, let's say, academic knowledge that's already in the academy and the kinds of epistemologies and ontologies that are cultivated completely outside the academy. Sometimes that's useful to inform these professions, and sometimes that knowledge is always located in community. And the strength, it seems, of a lot of the that you're describing is that they belong in community, and they're coming from that kind of knowledge, and not just from the academic side or the architect that's there. So I love to hear that. I think let's do one more question with this panel, and then we'll take a short break, and we'll come back and do some audience questions. It'll be a little bit shorter. So our question as the HADC is, we're really curious what kind of vision you have for the next generation. And I think, at least for me and Selina, maybe we are that generation, or maybe we're actually starting to talk about the generation that comes after us too. I'm curious what kinds of visions you have for kind of what comes next, either people who are kind of pursuing education through design or who are approaching design from a totally different direction. And what do you think needs to happen in the world, in these institutions, in the profession, in order to make that possible for young folks coming up?
I hope that academia catches up. And I mean that in a very serious curricular way. I don't know how we can intervene in this land as designers and not know the history of it. Right. So I've had this experience where, I've got 10 grad students, and we're talking about this particular community. And I realized more and more I have to layer on Indigenous history and culture and other sorts of things, not just about that place. And it's not their fault that they don't know it. It's not their fault that they didn't get it through their K through 12 education, or they didn't get it through their undergrad and they didn't get it through their first 2 years of grad school. It's not their fault. It's the system's fault. And it's really a shame and that's something that needs to change. I think that it really needs to be part of all of that curriculum. And I think as designers, we need to really, as design schools and academics, that needs to be a part of our curriculum. And it should go as far as saying, well, as an architecture student, because you are intervening in the land, you should take an Indigenous history course, probably. Right? If you are taking your architectural history course, there definitely should be a lecture about Indigenous architecture. If you're taking your building technology course and you're talking about masonry, you should be talking about Choctaw Canyon. You should be talking about those things, right? And even to Selina's point, if you're talking about human comfort and what that means to different people, you should be talking about the different places on this particular continent where there are extremes, right? There's extreme cold in my part of the country, and there's extreme heat in her part of the country. We should be talking about those things. All of those things should be a part of that. So I think that, my generation, we're the sort of like, there's a few of us. We're the first few geese at the head of the flock. We're breaking the wind for everyone else. And people like Johnpaul and Douglas Cardinal were even further ahead of that, right? Like they were like doing things, and I respect them as elders in this profession. And I think that your generation, Elsa and Selina and other sort of Indigenous students, are the ones that are starting to make these demands. And I think I see it from non-Indigenous students too, right? Like we're at a time of social justice reckoning, and our curriculums need to respond to that. And so that generation, I think, is like, let's demand it and let's hold these institutions accountable to do those things. And then the generation after, I would hope that more Indigenous people get into these professions, that you get into design planning, landscape architecture, even urban planning, urban policy, politics for sure, because that's the only way that these things are going to change, right? I hope that since we now have an Indigenous Secretary of the Interior, that we start to see some of these things change from the very top, and at least start to talk about us, right? To start to talk about that we're here, and we really need to begin to think about that, and that there are Indigenous people in the future, and it's okay to do that, and there are ways for us to preserve our culture and to push it into the future. That's my hope.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. During my going back to do my master's, I began to become really critical of my professors and the methodologies they were choosing to undertake, especially when the project or the site was focused in a, you know, what they would consider a low income neighborhood. And for me, those hypothetical projects that we create without community in these university settings is very problematic and is not helping anyone. And utilizing these old methodologies that come from the modernist movement was something that I just could not connect with, as I don't know if it's because I'm Indigenous or if because I'm a POC, but for me, that was wrong. And I voiced that opinion to my professor, and you know, they know my background and experience working through the IDC in Wanda, and, you know, being engaged with these projects, I could not return back to those old methodologies of doing things because it didn't mean anything to me. It wasn't informed by community. It wasn't informed by climate. It was meshing these different mediums that I just didn't connect to it. And, you know, I was very vocal about that to my professors, and they told me, well, one of them told me that a community does not prescribe their medicine. And for me, that really motivated me to move forward and to go outside of the university and create a program called Design Empowerment, in which I was invited into a community in South Phoenix here, and it's one of the communities that was historically redlined and where a majority of people of color were pushed out of the downtown Phoenix area. So I was invited into that community by a local activist. He was like, we need to bring more designers to our community. And it aligned with my more Xicana kind of roots as well. And from that program, now I'm able to engage with a variety of different schools, you know, out in South Phoenix who are wanting more of this information and design awareness to utilize design as a tool within these bigger contexts and the development infrastructure that is coming to those neighborhoods that, you know, they don't have designers from their communities. And, you know, I know growing up, I didn't see anybody or know about architecture at all. I didn't see anybody within the university who looked like me or was Indigenous in architecture. So I'm sure that's the same for some of the elders in, you know, architecture. And, you know, that's for me, my main motivation is to bring those younger generations to the table and try and assist a pathway with those design tools, or even just some sort of awareness about design.
When I was in architecture school back in the 60s, you had to take 2 years of the history of architecture of the world, you know, which was really exciting to kind of see these things from all over the world. And you got tested on it and all that. And at University of Oregon, the professor, when he came to, you know, indigenous architecture of the Americas, he hit on the Incas, and then he moved to China. and he just barely touched on that. So, you know, what I always say to people is that I didn't get much of an introduction to the rich architectural heritage of this country. I mean, it wasn't there. And it wasn't until I got out of school and got into practice that I started learning things and working for Native people. I started to look at all this stuff. And so when the University of Oregon said, okay, you've reached a point in your life and you've got some money to donate, and they said, would you donate some money to the School of Architecture to support our programs for students and the faculty and all that. And my partners, we did it for their universities and for mine. And I went to hand them the check and I hung on to it. And they couldn't take it. And I said, but you got to do one thing. You have to change your architectural history program, and you have to talk about Indigenous architecture in this country. And they did. They got the money and they did it. Okay. It's that opportunity to get that exposure, and for, you know, young Native people that are in these programs to kind of see something they can identify with and all that. So, and then I encouraged them to bring in, you know, Indigenous lecture people, not just in architects, but in the arts, in the writing, and in you know, and in architecture. And it was really interesting how that improved their program and brought in a more diverse student body for the architectural program and the landscape, the planning, and all that. So that's a key thing in our education, is to kind of like push that as hard as we possibly can, because I agree with Chris. This is a profession that really is great for young Native people to get into. It is terrific. The only problem that I happen when I talk to high school kids, is that Native high school kids, is they say, well, how much money do you make? That's their first question, because they know that they can get into computer stuff and get into that, and they can make a lot of money. And I try to explain to them, that's not why you should get into it. It'll improve. You'll make a lot good money in the future, but that's not why you should get into it. So it's we need to get more diversity in our colleges, and especially in the architecture schools, to make improvement. However, the last thing I could say is that just the experience working with the Chief Seattle Club here in Seattle, which is run 99% by Native people, and it's these young, enthusiastic Native folks that a lot of them are gone to college, and they're going for it. They're moving, and they're moving out there. And I plug into that wherever you can, boys, because that is really kind of the future. Because when I was back started all this stuff in the late 60s and early 70s, is that nobody paid any attention to us. If you got some baskets you can sell or something like that, that was all. So now they're really right in the middle of the community, asking the mayors and the city councils, and then they're getting up in front of everybody. And so I see things happening and changing. And so I think it's to the better. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for these stories. I'm really glad that this conversation can be shared with the GSD community, but also so much more widely. I know we have folks joining us from all over the continent, from Europe, from like way further away. So I'm really grateful to all of you for joining us today and contributing your stories here. Thank you so much. Let's take just like 2 or 3 minutes and get some water, take a break. And then we'll come back. We'll have just a few questions for you from the audience. So that ready to come back or trickle in for just a minute. We'll wait just 1 second for Chris. There we go. We may have lost Johnpaul, so we'll see if he's able to come back in. But I do have, Rogelio, let's start with question number 2 in the chat, or in the document rather.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you to the audience for all the questions. They're great. I'll start off with Manuel. Sorry if I mispronounce this, but Shivartsberg, Kario. Many thanks for the amazing presentations. I was wondering if the panelists have any thoughts on the connections between Native housing and the expansive notion of infrastructure that is being discussed nowadays with the Red Deal and similar initiatives. It seems like thinking about Native housing as a node with an Indigenous infrastructure, as the panelists are suggesting, is so crucial. Do you have a sense if Secretary Hallen's recent appointment could usher in positive developments in this regard? Best wishes from the University of California, San Diego, on unceded Kumeyaay land.
Not familiar with the Red Deal. I don't know if someone else is, but not quite sure what that's referencing. But I do think that housing is an infrastructural issue, and so if the Bureau of Indian Affairs has control over roads and other sorts of things that run through reservations, housing should be a part of that. Can they leverage these kinds of things with it? And I do think that infrastructure needs to be designed in a indigenous way as well. I don't think that we should assume that the sort of those kinds of issues are the same on reservation land as they are in other places. What does an indigenous road actually look like? I don't know, but I think we need to ask the question. Or a bridge, or, what are we connecting, or how do things work? My reservation has a state highway that runs through it. And so they've been trying to deal with that to get it to bypass the reservation. I think it was a kind of form of redlining, but it was a way to kind of separate it. It made the sort of community a little dangerous because you had high-speed traffic kind of going through the reservation, even though it wasn't 55 miles an hour, it was lower, but it still made things challenging. So I would hope that Secretary Haaland starts to address these issues, and because she's the one that's kind of in charge of the BIA, and appointing people that would want to rethink those things, young Indigenous people who would want to rethink those things.
Yeah, I'm also not too familiar with that situation, but I know, there's a variety of challenges of construction on Indian country in general. The contractors and the people who are creating these projects or building these projects, that historical and cultural understanding, all the regulations with tribal, state, and federal, there's so many barriers and all those different kind of permissions that you have to go through. And it's really based on the individual governance of each tribe, which are all have different capacities to make these projects happen within their own kind of departments. And then, the constant decision making and the changes within those structures as well within our tribes, whether that's the tribal council, whether that's the, the main leaders involved in many of these governments. It's so complicated. And I think that's why it's really important to have this younger generation step up and lead those conversations, and for the elders to understand that they need to start including us into the conversations, because we are the future. Am I right? We are the ones who are going to be pushing that on to the next generation. So I think we need to reevaluate the mindsets that we are approaching this work with, and getting, once again, more people into these positions for that capacity building.
Okay. So the next question is from Melvin Toddy. I am interested in the subject Chris brought up regarding building and zoning codes. On several occasions, I've heard several American Indian designers discuss development of a vernacular or indigenous architecture guide. Often, Native tribes adopt the current building and or zoning codes in adjacent or local border towns. AHJ's authorities having jurisdiction. My question is, what specific building code chapters or zoning codes do you see that need to change or need amending?
I don't see it so much as like specific codes and chapters, although there's a few that come to mind, but I do think it's just about how they're administered. So I'll back that up for a second. To me, it's about sovereignty. It's about complete and total sovereignty. Because if you are an indigenous person, if you are, and your land is in trust, meaning you're on reservation land, you actually don't have to adhere to building codes. So when I worked on projects, I worked for offices and I did projects for my own tribe. We'd send them to the state for code review, and they'd send it back and say, look, we don't have to review this because we don't have any jurisdiction. But we'd say, no, our clients want you to review it. And so give us the suggestions, and they send back the list. The wonderful thing is then you sit down with the client and go through the list. Which of these things do I want to do? And which of these things I can't or don't need to? I think that's how it should be, because the indigenous communities are adopting, my tribe adopts the state sort of building codes and national building codes just sort of wholeheartedly. And I would also like to include sustainability standards. I think every nation should have its own sustainability standards that are written in a culturally appropriate way. So, so for instance, like if I was writing the part of the building code that talked about egress windows, right? And I think the code is like you have to have a 2-foot cube fit through the thing so that people can crawl out of your window if there's a fire at the door. Why isn't that a part of a story where someone did it or didn't do it and the consequences of that, instead of saying just this or that, right? It's like when I teach the building, comprehensive building studio to my grad students for most architecture schools have this, right? Where you have to do a building and then you have to do a code review and all that other stuff. And so the code book that I always use is like the Frank Ching one that's illustrated, because it's much easier to understand it when you see these graphics. And my point is, instead of the graphics, let's have something culturally appropriate. Let's like tell a story about these particular codes, and we can tell a story about an entire chapter of codes. Can we do that? The other thing is that when you have sovereignty on this land and the land is held in collective, what is the need for property lines, right? Like, why do we have to have this sort of suburban home plot land thing that has setbacks and other sorts of things so that every home is the same? Can we start to think about those things as collectives? Can we start building homes as collectives so that we could start to think about how do they work? Do you have an ADU on your property that is either for your grandmother or you rent it out for extra income or something like that, right? Does that thing actually cross what would normally be a property line because you're holding the land in community? So for me, it's just like saying, okay, if we're taking this sort of paternalistic relationship that we have with the government, and we are sovereign on our own lands, let's be sovereign on our own lands and break that paternal relationship, and really discuss what that means. We might adopt certain parts of the code. We might adopt certain zoning things. We might adopt certain planning procedures and things, but let's have that discussion. Let's not just like always wholeheartedly take those things on. I think that that's part of the sort of colonization of the whole reservation land, right? Like, if we're sovereign on the land, let's be sovereign on the land. Let's not be sovereign on the land and live under someone else's rules.
Yeah, I feel like Chris covered that pretty well, and I'm not an expertise on, working on tribal lands, but it seems as though, developing our own codes within our own nation is not the main priority at the moment. Hence why we utilize the codes adjacent to us, or the already established codes within the state or within the larger context. So yeah, I don't have much else to add.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I think we can, if you have any last thoughts or comments to contribute, those are very welcome. We can also end it here because it's we're right at time. I want to respect that.
I think I just want to conclude by saying, like, this is an important issue. It really is. I think that Indigenous people have been underserved by housing, and we should be talking about it in architecture schools. We should be designing it. We should be wrestling with this problem, and then allow the outcomes of that to help inform larger decisions. It seems like there are a lot of policy, and like I always get these like conferences invitations and things like that. Like most of it is like, how do you get these sort of contracts? And I forget who brought it up, but there are bigger companies that are non-Indigenous that are actually doing this housing. And I think that's where another level of sovereignty, where the tribe should be doing housing. We should be doing housing not only for ourselves, but other nations. We should be collective. We should have a consortium of Indigenous designers, Indigenous builders, Indigenous manufacturers, Indigenous fabricators, Indigenous communities that can work together, whether it's in a region, multiple states, single state, whatever it is, and allow those borders to be a little bit more elastic. But I do think it starts in architecture school. I think we should be looking at these problems and addressing them and understanding them, because it's a place to generate ideas. So that's my thought about it. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree. at least in my, I recently graduated, but a lot of students were exploring housing, especially on Navajo Nation. And a lot of people within the master's program that year were really interested in addressing those type of situations, whether that's, bringing modular type designs, looking at sustainability. All of these things can be explored through studios in a meaningful way through good methodology led by Indigenous communities and activists. So I think there's so much opportunity to really give back and to support our Indigenous communities within academia.
Thank you both so much for these thoughts. I'm so grateful that we could bring you here, and I hope we can actually welcome you to a physical building at some point. But I'm just so grateful that you're able to contribute these thoughts to this educational community, and also that, given all the drawbacks of the current situation, that the one kind of bright side is that we do have this broader reach, and we can welcome a lot more people, regardless of kind of cost and distance. Zoom problems notwithstanding, into the discussion, and then make sure that this is something that's not just valuable to people receiving an Ivy League education, but much more broadly, because the concerns and the conceits that I think so many students here are really hungry to engage with go so far beyond some of those conventions. And so I'm just so glad to hear these ideas shared out today. And we'll be in touch, but have a wonderful day. Thank you to everyone who could join us here. And we will have the videos of these two events posted online for you soon.
Thank you.